my name is Bob Hunter. If any of you haven't had my class or met me yet, I'm the tools editor for Wood. So I do all the tool reviews, the tool content in the magazine and on our website. And I get to, like Dave said, I get to talk with the tool manufacturers and play with new tools and all that. And so it's kind of like getting to play in the toy closet all the time. Just, it's so much fun. So there's all kinds of interesting stuff. And in addition to doing that, I also write some of the how-to articles for Wood on the projects and some of the techniques. I don't get to spend as much time in the shop as John and Kevin, our project builders, but I'm working on kind of overthrowing them and trying to take their role. So I want to do with all of that. But anyway, so what I do in woodworking is I like to do a variety of things. I like to do natural edge projects. So that's one of my classes that I teach. I love doing that. I've been doing that for several years. I also like to make furniture and stuff if I can. And one of the other things I really like is box making, because it's just such a fun way to take advantage of a lot of small scraps that you might have, or some really prized wood that you might have a short piece of. You can incorporate it into a project. It's a good way to learn different types of joinery or different skills and practice different looks and stuff. So, you know, I've had a lot of boxes that get sort of done and then end up in the fire pit, and some of them I'll just pass them on. So. But, you know, it's just a good way to practice stuff. So if you don't make anything like that, I would encourage you to try it, because it's a good way to get started and trying to learn a lot of different techniques or things, or even finishes or something. And so what we're going to cover today is 3 types of box joints. First one is actually called, oddly enough, a box joint or a finger joint. So it's just these little rectangular square fittings. You can make them different sizes. We're going to make one of those. We're going to do splined miter joints. So this is a mitered box with a miter with a spline cut into it and installed to help strengthen it. And we're going to show a sliding dovetail box, which may be kind of hard to see from there. The legs, the sliding dovetails go down into the leg. So I'll show you that one as well. Feel free to take a look at any of these if you'd like after class, and we'll kind of talk through them as we go. So with a box joint, what you're doing is it's sometimes called a finger joint because it's kind of like this, where you get the interlocking thing. There's no mechanical lock like a dovetail has, but it's just a good, solid, old school joint. So you get a lot of glue surface. These have been made for centuries. They're just really, really strong. They're easy to cut. I'm going to show you how to do it on the table saw. You can also do it on a router table real easily. You can hand cut them if you don't, like yourself very much and you want to torture yourself. You can hand cut those. I don't know why you would want to do that, but you can certainly. So what I want to start out with in this is to show you a couple of ways. You could do this with a regular table saw blade. You can get your rip blade, and you can cut them and stagger them and make multiple passes. It's a lot of work. They're not as much fun to do it that way. I wouldn't really want to recommend that. You could also do it with your dado set, stack your dados together and make them. So with a stacked dado set, when you get the outer blades, the teeth have kind of a little bit like this. So one goes left, one goes right, and then your spacers, your chippers in between have square teeth that fill in. So what happens is then if you cut your box joints with this, you're going to end up with with a joint that looks like this. Little Batman. I'm exaggerating a little, but you'll end up with those tiny little sharp there, because those teeth on those alternating bevel teeth stick up just a little bit more proud of the chippers, so you don't get a perfectly flat box joint like that. That's what you're looking for. So that's where you want something with just completely flat teeth. And so you can certainly do this and then go back if you want and sand it and kind of get rid of those, or hope that nobody really notices. It's pretty minimal. I mean, it's minor, but it is there. It is something. So if you're somewhat of a perfectionist and you want to get rid of it, don't want to have that, the best solution that we've found is what they call a box joint or finger joint saw blade set. It's a 2-piece set that are flat top teeth, and this one I think is 24 tooth blades. You get them so they're flat and they angle, or they're offset a little bit more to one side than the other, so that if you put them together and it tells you on the side, this side out for 3/8, this side in for 1/4. so that when you stack them together, they kind of overlap each other, and that's going to give me a 1/4 inch box joint. Then if I turn them around the other way and go out, that's going to give me a 3/8 box joint. And it's going to be a perfectly flat rectangular cut that we're doing. This is a Forest product from Forest Blades. Freud also makes one of these. Those are the only two that I'm aware of at the moment that make them. There might be others there in the market, but this set will run you maybe, I don't know, $150 to $200 if you want to get it. Really, really nice if you can come up with those, though. It's just called a box joint or finger joint set. So I'm going to show you how to make a 3/8 box joint. So we're going to install the blades. So it says on there, this side out for 3/8, this side out for 1/4. So I'm going to go with 3/8. And then you just stagger them, lock them together. Okay. Then I've got a zero clearance insert. Just helps to have that. If you can make one, you don't have to have zero clearance, but it just helps to get you a little bit closer there. So my stock that I'm using is 1/2 inch thick. So what I want to do is then I want to cut my box joints up here at just a little bit more than a 1/2 inch, because when I put that together, then I want them to be just a little bit proud after they come together, so that I can trim them off flush. If they don't come out even, then you've got to start removing material from the face of the board, so you don't want to have to do that. Make them just a little bit proud. So what I want to do then is set my blade for a 1/2 inch, just a whisker over that. This one is just a little snug. Okay, so I'm just a little over that. That's just a little bit snug, so I'm going to do a quick test cut here just to make sure I'm not. Okay, we're good. Okay, so now we've got the blade set to cut 3/8 wide and a 1/2 inch tall. So what I want to do next then is to take and put a fence on my miter gauge. So I'm going to build a jig to make these. Just take your regular miter gauge, set it 90 degrees, just a piece of plywood to make your little fence, something like that. What I found, it's an arbitrary number, but I found that it works pretty good. I just set the rip fence at 7 inches and lock that in place. So then what I want to do is I'm going to cut a notch in that. So I'm going to hold the plywood against the fence and into the miter gauge. This is not attached at any point. This is loose. And I'm okay to do that. I'm not going to bind it because I'm not making a through cut. There's no cutoff that's going to get stuck there. I'm going to go through and it's not going to bind or anything, so it's okay to do that in this case. So let's make the first notch. So there we have a 3/8 wide, 1/2 inch tall slot. So then what you need to do is to get some hardwood strips, whatever kind, something in the hard, like white oak, maple, something that's not going to like degrade, or you want it to, it's going to hold its form. And I'd say make about a foot long, make you a little blank, and then run it through your planer or whatever you can get. So you want to ideally end up with a piece that's 3/8 wide, and I make them just 3/8 square. You can do it because even though my stock is 1/2 inch, I don't need this to be that tall. So I just go ahead and make a 3/8 by 3/8 blank. So I run this through my planer or hand plane it, whatever it takes to get you to that size, because you want to sneak up on it and get that cut. And you want that to be just right. That's a little snug. But that's what you're looking for, is to get that. You want to be able to have that as your. So once I get that to my point, I'm a little bit snug. This kind of swelled up on me I made this a week ago. It's got a little moisture on it and swelled up. So then I want to take, and I'm going to make a second piece, because what I'm going to end up with is this is going to be my step block. But I don't need it to be a foot long, so I'm just going to have like about a 3-inch piece or so is all I need. So I'm going to cut off 3 inches of it. Roughly. There's no exact measurement here, just a short piece. Okay, so now I have 2 pieces. So I'm going to cut now a second notch. So I want to put those 2 pieces against the rip fence. I'm not moving my rip fence from my 7-inch spot. Leave it locked. So now what I want to do is to take my plywood that I cut earlier, slide it over against those two pieces, and now I'm going to cut a second notch. Now I don't want to drag those 2 pieces along the fence with me. I'm just using that for my placement. So get it held against your miter gauge, pull those out of the way, and let's make the second cut. And now I've got my 2 cuts that I need. So now we don't need the longer piece anymore. The only reason I say to make it long is so that you can get it through a planer if you have to, because you try to run a 6-inch piece through your planer, it doesn't really work well, it could get caught in there. So 12 inches gives you enough length to work with on the planer. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill a hole through this, because this is going to go in as my gauge block. So what I want to do is I've taken the liberty of pre-drilling this. So I'm going to put this on. Okay, so just drill a little hole for it. I'm just using a little brass screw. Anything small. You could also use a nail. You could put glue on there if you wanted. Just anything to hold it in place. If you made it a 1/2 inch, it would ride down on there, but mainly all we're looking for is that's going to be our spacer. So then what we have to do now is attach this to our miter gauge. So now when I put that up against there, see I'm going freely through there, so that becomes my gauge now to make my step and repeat cuts. So what I want to do is to make a test cut. Before we anchor this, we can do this with, I just put a couple of screws through the back of the miter gauge. So let me get that. Okay, so we're still in business. So now my fence is locked in there. Now I no longer need this, so I can move the rip fence. So now I want to take a couple of scrap pieces and test my fit, first of all. So the first part, I'm going to make one side of a block, and then the other one will have an offset, and I'll make it and test just one joint. So let me cut that real quick. So just hold it. You don't have to clamp it. Just hold it with both fingers. If you're not comfortable having your fingers that close to the blade, then you can use a clamp. Like I say, I'm just a little tight on my... Give you a little tip here. So, okay, I end up with a little bit left, it's not a perfect match. So what I tend to do when I'm making box joints like this is I make my stock a little bit wider. I know I can do the math and hopefully come out right on it, but I'd rather make it a little bit wider, and then afterward, after I get them all done, then I'll go back and I'll rip that little section off, and then I'll have a perfect box fit. Because sometimes this, if you get the box joint that isn't perfect, the saw blade system or the cutter or whatever you're using isn't exactly 3/8 to the money, it's easier to do it this way and then rip that little bit off. So now for our second piece, I'm going to use this one first as a gauge. So I put it down over the block like that, and now I'm going to cut another joint, the other half of the joint. I only need to use this for the first cut, so now I take this piece off, put that aside. So I'm a little bit off there, but now I can go and use this, slide it right over the gauge, and then I can continue on. Okay, so now we've got a box joint that fits nicely. And it's a little bit proud, which again, I can trim off. I'm probably a little tall there. You could reduce that if you wanted, but that's not hurting anything. So what I want to do then is just go ahead and make that joint. Main thing is get my box joints here that makes up to all that, rip them to width after I've got them all cut, and then you'll have a perfect box joint to go. And then you can save this jig because it's going to be set up from here forward. You can always do more joints then. So you would just go through and do each of your box joints. You do 2. In this case, if mine are all the same size, so I would do 2 of each, so that you would have, because you've got to have this interlocking, you've got to have the opposing sides have to be milled the same way, so the way I do that is to do each of them first, so that you're starting with one against the gauge block here. So you're starting there, mill that one, do your second one like this, same way, then do your another piece that's the opposing side, do those 2 the same way, then come back and get your other set of pieces, put them up there, make those cuts, and get them so that you can have them opposing. So you want to make sure that they're going to marry up as you go around the box. So the question was, what kind of a bottom would you put in this? So when you've got a box joint, you don't want to make anything that's going to exit. So you don't want to put a groove that's going to show from the outside. So you can't really, I can't take these pieces over here and run them across the table saw and cut a slot in there for that, because it's going to make a slot that's going to show here. So you don't want to end up with that. So what I would do is, after I get my box made, is I would put it together, dry clamp it, and then I would put what they call a box slotting bit. It's basically just a slotting cutter with a bearing on it, and then you would run that. So let's say that's the bearing. I'll use this end here. So let's say that's the cutter. Then you would just go from the inside, and you would just work your way around. And what it does is it cuts a slot inside while it's dry clamped, so that you don't see that and then it rounds the corners because it's a radius bit. So it's going to leave rounded corners. You would just have to then cut your bottom to fit that, including sanding off the corners. Lee Valley makes those. They call it a box slotting bit, but any slot cutter would do the same thing. But you just do that on the router table afterward. You get it dry clamped. You got to do it before you glue it, because obviously then your bottom becomes trapped in there. So you have to put that in as you're gluing the box together. And then the other thing is, as you're doing this, make sure you sand the inside faces of your box pieces and the bottom before you assemble, because that way you don't have to do it and try to do it in an assembled box. It's a lot easier to get all that sanding done ahead of time. One of the other tips that I've got with sanding on the box joints is, don't use a random orbit sander to sand the inside faces. Do this by hand. Sand with the grain by hand. Because what happens is, as you're sanding, so let's say this is your board. Sorry, my drawing's there. But so you put your sander up here. Well, that random orbit sander pad So that's your sander. What happens is that as you go out here, that pad wants to sag a little bit, and it's going to round over this corner just ever so slightly on this. So you don't want to end up getting those rounded, because then it's going to show and it's going to leave a gap on the outside of your box that you're going to see. And then you're going to think your box joints aren't coming together, when in fact they are. You just rounded over that crisp edge. So do strictly hand sanding along there to keep those joints nice and crisp. As far as the outside of it, I do that after I've assembled. So glue your box together, wipe off any glue or clean it off with a chisel or whatever, and then afterward trim them flush, then go over it with a sander. You can use your random orbit sander at that point, because if you round it over, nobody's really going to see if it's slightly rounded. You can also hand sand it at that point, but you're not losing anything because the glue joint has already been locked together and set. With spline miters, it's just a simple way of you're just making a mitered box. That's your first step, is to make a mitered box, and then we're going to cut the splines in it, and I'll show you that. There's a couple different varieties, different options you can do with that. So the first thing is to make a mitered box. You're just cutting 4 pieces with miters on each corner. Opposing sides have to be of the same length. This one happens to be square. You could make them the rectangular, but they have to be equal. And I find that it's a lot easier and a lot more accurate to cut miters on the table saw than on a miter saw. So if any of you have not taken John Olson's mitering class, you might want to do that. But simple thing, you don't even need to do that. Just make them on the table saw. Get you a nice blade, get you a good cross-cutting blade, if you're using a 10-inch table saw, which we probably all are. Get an 80-tooth cross-cutting blade dedicated for that, so that it's really going to cut fine without chipping out. You can put an auxiliary fence on your miter gauge like this. I highly recommend getting an aftermarket miter gauge, something like this Incra. This is a really good one. Anything that's going to give you the extra precision, because this thing, when you lock that into 45 degrees, it's going to be right on. You can do it that way, where you can tilt it to 45. That's one way. I prefer actually cutting them with a bevel, where I tilt the blade, raise it up, tilt the blade 45, and cut my miters that way with the miter gauge at 90 degrees. So that's the best way to do that, to make your mitered box. So now I'm just putting on my rip blade. I have a full kerf rip blade, because again, I want flat topped. Same reason we talked about with box joints is I don't want my ATB blade on there. I don't want my 40 or 50 tooth blade, because it's going to cut these, and it's going to leave this kind of a groove. And even though I'm going across here, I still don't want those little Batman ears on there. I want a good flat bottom, and that's why I'm using a rip blade, because all the teeth are flat bottom or flat tipped teeth. So in this case, I'm actually making a rip cut when we cut those slots, those spline slots. So I want to do that. And let's say you've got a piece that you want to do a miter box. Excuse me. You want to do a pattern wrapped box is what we call it. So if you want to make where the grain continues on around the miter, you're going to get 3 of the joints that are going to be exact miters. So that's what this is, a continuous grain pattern wrap box. It's made out of pine. It's a little hard to tell. Here's my starting point, so that I cut them in sequence, and that grain just wraps perfectly around there. So the way to do that is pretty simple. Let's see, do we have an eraser here? You can't see back there. So if you have your board 3/4 of an inch, let's just say this is a long board, and let's say we're going to make a rectangular board. So you don't want to cut your 2 long pieces out first, because they need to be on opposing sides. So you want to chase it around, and you want to cut, you're going to want a long and a short board. So you're going to want to cut a miter here, and then this is going to be your second one. Then you're going to cut a miter here, and then this is going to be a longer one. I'm going to run out of room here if I do this. Another short one, and then another long one, another long one. Oh, that's supposed to be that way. So the way to do that here is you're getting a short, a long, a short, and a long, and then when you put them together, they'll wrap around and your grain will continue around. And the way I do that is when I number my joints just to make sure that I get everything matched up. So I'll write on the edge of the board, before I make any cuts, I'll lay this out, and I'll put 1, 2, 2, 3, 4 and 1, so that then after I get my boards apart, especially if they're really hard to figure out the grain, then I can just look at that and immediately, and I can match up my numbers, and they'll go right back together. So that would get you a pattern-wrapped, mitered box that's going to come together with perfect miter joints. A table saw will get those spot on. I know a lot of you guys will probably want to cut yours on the miter saw. If you can do it and get a spot on 45, that's excellent. Go ahead and do it. In my experience, it's really hard to cut 8 precise miters on a miter saw. They just have a little bit too much play in them because of the movement of the mechanics of the saw, just a little bit. It's really hard to get precise miters. And if you want to make a really nice box, you don't want to see any gaps. So you want to have a perfect miter come together and have that. So what you want to do then is go ahead and you want to get this box ready to glue up. But then we think, okay, before we glue it though, what do we want to do? The gentleman asked earlier about putting a bottom in it. So if you want to put a bottom in beforehand, you can do that before gluing it up. And because this is, you can cut a slot in this and it'll never show, you can cut that before you do your joinery. So I want to cut a slot in the bottom for a groove in there to set the bottom in so it would be embedded. And because it's on the inside, that will fully be housed. You'll never see those exit points. So you could just set your rip fence up, set your blade real shallow for like 1/8 of an inch or so, 1/4 inch deep. You don't want to go real deep. No more than half the thickness of your board, whatever your box side is. Don't go any deeper than half the thickness. So that you could just set it up and just run and make a rip cut. And if you do it with your scissor blade, then just slide the fence and make another cut until you've got a perfect fit for whatever plywood or whatever bottom you've got, so that you get a nice solid fit. You don't want it sloppy in there again. You don't need to set up a dado set to do this. Just use your regular rip blade if you want, or your combo blade will work for that. And just make a couple of cuts until you get the perfect slot for your bottom. So then cut out your bottom to fit. You don't have to round the corners because it's going to fit into there perfectly as a square or a rectangle. And then glue this up. Just put glue on both sides of the miter joint. So 8 miters, 8 faces that get glue. Put it all in there. The bottom just floats. You don't glue the bottom in place. It just sits in there because it's trapped. It can't get out. So glue that together, clamp it up, and let it dry. Then once it is dry, get it out, sand away any extra glue that might be out. Just kind of crisp up your miters again. If there's any glue squeeze out or anything there, just get rid of that. If you did clamp too hard and maybe you kind of dented the miter a little bit, just kind of sand it away till you get it, till you get it back crisp again. So get your box. This box now would be ready to do splines on it. So we've got our rip blade in place. So now we're going to make a saddle jig. It's a pretty simple jig. I think you guys are all smart enough. You can look at this and see what I did. Just a saddle jig that rides over the fence. Put a couple of pieces on here with miters. I cut miters so it's riding on the table surface. And then I'm just going to rest my box in that to cut my slots. Now, if you've got any screws in this, which I do, you want to make sure those are above the height of the blade. You don't want to saw into any screws. And I do not glue these runners here on. I want to just screw those on because I can replace those later if this gets chewed up. I've made a lot of boxes and it's kind of chewed up. I want to replace those. I don't want to have to build the whole jig again. All I need to do is build these 2 arms on the sides. So if everybody can see that, this sits flat on the table saw. So all you need there is just a couple of miters, and they're screwed from the back. But make sure those screws are above the blade height. You don't want to get into that. So then you just set your box in there, and you say, okay, where do I want to put the splines? Where do I want to do it? How deep do I want to do it? First thing you got to do is decide how deep. So you don't want to, or maybe you don't want to cut inside the box. So let's say, first of all, you do not. So we want to set the blade shallow so that you can cut, because this is a glued up box, so it's not going to come apart on you, hopefully. You glued it well. And so what I would recommend is try to get as close as you can, as tall as you can on the blade so that you're cutting as deep as possible without cutting through the miter. So in this case, that's pretty close to the top of that. So let's say that's what you want to do. That's going to give you a wider spline slot on the outside. So first, let me show you what it looks like with a short one. Let's say I don't do it very tall. So I've got my height set. what I'm going to do is here, I've already kind of measured and determined where I wanted that first slot to be. So I'm just going to line that up with the blade, if I can find it here. So I'm looking for that now that so you're coming back to it a second time. You want that to kind of slide over there without moving the blade. So I'm sliding that back and forth. The blade is not moving. Lock my fence in place. So now let's make a cut. Just hold this in place. Easy, done. There's a little spline slot. Nothing to it. But now let's say you want to go deeper than that, because you want that, you can go deeper because we weren't all the way up to the bottom of this, to the heel of the miter. So we can go taller. So I want to go back up here. And I can go right there. So now I'm taller than I have been in that slot. So it's going to cut it's going to cut a little bit taller slot in my jig too, which is no problem. So now I'm going to cut a different. So now, as you can see, I've cut a much wider slot than the first one. So if you want, it's just so that you can add a little bit more decorative, and I've not cut through the box on the inside of the heel there. So that would allow me then to put a much wider spline slot. So that if I have my slot, there's what it's going to look like. So first, before we get to that point though, let's say you there is a time when you might want to cut through that heel. I cut the top and bottom so that they did not go through the heel on the inside of the miter, but the middle one does. It went all the way through, so that what I have is I have a natural shelf support right there. So you just have to watch that you don't get glue when you glue it together. You've got a nice little shelf support. So just build that, and then you've got a nice little thing. Just another little way of making, not only do you get the support for your shelf, you get a different look here, so you can get a little bit deeper on your miters. You can stagger them, you can do them in sequential, you can do them the same. With this box, I did 3 of them the same. You can do them, you can angle your blade, bevel it, tilt it, whatever, and then make your slots the same. As long as you're using one blade, the same blade, your splines are going to fit. Now with something like this, obviously then you have to cut a wider piece to get your spline in there. And I'll get to that here in a minute. So now we're going to cut some splines. Just get a piece of something that's wider than what the depth is on there. So this is a piece of 5/4 walnut that I'm going to cut off some splines. And then what you want to do is have a stop block to put in out here to the left of your blade, so that what you can do is once you find it'll take some trial and error to get the perfect thickness that you're going to cut. So I'm going to put that out here. I'm going to lock that in place. And then I'm going to make a rip cut, and then I'm going to see if that spline fits my slot. If it doesn't, then I'm going to adjust this, make another cut until I got it perfect. And then once I do, then I'll cut as many strips as I need. Let's say you're making 4 boxes. Each box has maybe, it will have 8 miters, 8 slots on it, so you're going to need quite a few of those. So I'll cut out 2 or 3 of them. Once you get your stop set, then just go ahead and rip a couple of pieces to have them. That's just a simple thing. Any little stop out here will work. You can make your own little jig, anything with a screw, anything that's adjustable, that's got some fine adjustment. This is a little rockler jig that I like, but anything that's got that. And the reason I do it this way, rather than setting it over here, is because I'm only needing 1/8 of an inch, or somewhere in that neighborhood, slot. I don't want to have that setting that close to the blade and then rip, and then have that piece stuck in there and maybe get kicked back at me, maybe get pulled down into the miter, into the table saw. I want to do it over here to the left where I can just use a stop and keep moving like that. So that's the safer way to do that. And then just make as many strips as you need. So let's say you've cut your box, you've got your splines glued in place. So then when you're trimming these, you've got a fragile point right out here at the point, right at the point of the miter is the most fragile part of this. So you don't want to just cut and tear and pull this way. So whether in this case, I'm using a Japanese saw that cuts on a pull stroke. So I don't want to pull it toward me because I might tear that out, and I have done this. I don't want to tear that off. So what I want to do is start and cut it the other way, and cut it. So pull from the point of the miter back toward me. Be real gentle there, just cut it off. Work my way around, then I'll go over here, switch to this side, and do the same. The nice thing about Japanese saws is that they're flush trimming saws. This one doesn't scratch the maple here at all. It only cuts the walnut. You can do this with a Western saw too, but then you're not going to probably get as close, and you might scar that wood because they have the set in the teeth. So you want to make sure you're doing that. Or you can use any kind of flush trimming saw will work, but that'll work. That'll get you the closest. If you're using a Western style saw, you know, that you cut on the push stroke, then what you might want to do then is stay back a little bit, maybe put a little spacer, a little piece of thin cardboard or something in there as a spacer to keep you from scratching your wood surface, because you don't want to add a bunch of scratches that you're going to have to sand out that then might compromise your miter. You want to just make sure you get that good. So then after you've gotten those kind of cut close, then just take a block plane and trim those flush. I'll see if I can do this here, balancing this. Work from the point of the miter backwards. So don't take it this way outward, because you might break off that fragile little point of grain right there in your spline slot. So work from here and just trim that flush. You can also sand it if you want, but then again, with the random orbit sander, you run that risk again of rounding over that miter out there on the edge. You don't want to do that, because even though they say that they'll sand flat, the random orbit sander pad is just made of, you know, of stiff kind of plastic foam stuff. It's pretty flexible, so you don't want to really sand that and round over your crisp corners that you worked a lot harder to get. So go ahead and cut all those off, sand them flush, and then come back and sand your box and get it all ready. And this one does not have a bottom in it. So let's say if we wanted to, you could come back and figure out a way to put a bottom in there. You can add any kind of ways, you know, to do that. You could rabbet the bottom and then put one in from underneath. You could make a base that sets it so that it would mount down into or something. So any kind of ways you can do that. I like to put the bottoms in usually before I cut the slots. Have one more option that I wanted to show you. You can also put a spline slot in the lid, as I did here, which works the same way, only it's just not a box. It's just a piece of 3/4 or whatever, 1/2 inch stock, whatever you've got. So I just put my lid on here, and I just, set the depth or whatever, and I just cut. And what it does is it just cuts a recess here that's 1/8 of an inch deep, and then you just fill it with a stick of wood. Just again, the same thing. You're just like gluing a spline in there, only you don't have wood above it. And in this case, I had made up a blank of cherry and ash down the center where I could make my handle, and then I just had some left over, so I used that for my spline slots. So just another way. So just by adding it to lid, another little decorative effect that you can do with the same jig, with the same rip system of cutting your spline slots. But you can see how much wider I had to make these then to get that maximum height that I could do. So just another little way of kind of adding something to it. What I'm making is a box that has sliding dovetails in the leg. So the dovetail part becomes the leg. So in each of these legs, I'm cutting a groove in there for each of the box sides. So I want a piece, so let's say my box sides are 1/2 inch. So whatever side you want to pick, okay, that's going to be my side. I'm using a 3/8 dovetail bit, so 3/8 inch wide. So I've got to factor in what's the size of my box and what's the size of my legs. So my boxes are going to be 1/2 inch wide. So then I've got to figure that my leg stock needs to be twice that. So if my boxes are 1/2, then this needs to be a 1 inch square leg. The reason for that is because you need to be able to have room for the dovetail sockets without them overlapping and collapsing on each other. So as you saw with that square, with the top of the leg view here, what we're going to do is we're going to cut a dovetail slot in this face and in this face down the length of it. And you don't want to get them so close together that this little tiny neck here becomes a weak point and breaks off. So you've got to have some mass right here in the middle of this neck. And so to do that, the way I do that is to have my stock twice the width. So if I can do that, I need to have, now if you're going to use a wider dovetail bit, then your stock needs to be even that much wider. So I'm using a 3/8 inch wide bit, which means it's 3/8 inch at the widest point of the slot, at the tip of it. That's going to be 3/8 inches wide. And I'm only going to go 1/4 of an inch deep on this because I don't need a lot of reference. I just need it to get in there and lock. It'll make a good locking joint. So what I do is make up 2 blanks, in this case walnut, just 1 inch square, and I'm going to cut 1 on each end, and then after I get my slots cut, then I'll cut them to length because I don't want to work with 4-inch long pieces. I want to work with a longer piece that I can control better. So I've got my 3/8 inch dovetail bit in the router table. If anybody wants to know anything on router lifts, this is my favorite lift, JSM. It's the Master lift, they call it, Master lift. It's my favorite router lift, best one on the market. So if you're looking to buy one, that's the one to get. JSM, Jessem, Master lift. The second best one on the market is the other JSM model. So now I'm not going to be needing to use the fence opening, so I want to close that down. So in this case, I need to, because I'm going to be running stock, the fence is going to be behind the bit, so it's not going to be captured in there. I want to close these together. Okay, so I know I'm not going to get into the bit because my fence is going to be back a ways. So what I want to do is, I want to set my bit height for 1/4 of an inch. You don't need a router lift for this, but it sure makes it easier. Okay, so now I want to set the fence to whatever my layout marks. I didn't lay this out, but I'll just kind of give you, so you want to figure that where you want to do this. You want it pretty close to the edge, but not so close to it again that it's going to be weak and break off. So you want that about a good 1/8 of an inch to 3/16 is pretty close there. And I'll just make a light cut and show you kind of what I mean. I'll just make a little quick cut and show you just a bump cut here. And since this is a really small bit, I want to run it pretty fast. So I've got it running about 22,000, something like that. So you can zoom in on that. So you can see how close I am to the edge, about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. So what I'm going to do is to make 1 slot here, flip around and make 1 here, then I'm going to do the same on this piece. So I'm going to make all 4 legs at one time, 1 slot at a time though. So now I want to say, okay, the other thing is my box sides are 3 1/4 inches tall. So I've got to make then, my slot has to be 3 1/4 inches long, or roughly thereabout. So it can't be any more than that because then it'll show. But I don't want it to be that fully long, so I'm going to make it just a little bit less because with the round at the bottom of the slot, it's rounded, and I'm going to have a square piece. So rather than have to round off the tail on this, I'm just going to make it 1/4 of an inch shorter so that my slot is a little bit longer, and then I'll show you how to cut that off here in a little bit. So then I'm going to make, in this case, these legs are 4 1/4. So I'm going to make the legs longer. I'll cut them off afterward because I'll have plenty of length. So I want to set my slot. I'm just going to use any kind of stop. You can set a clamp stop, whatever. You want to set a stop past the bit. Since my box sides were 3 1/4 and I want to stop 1/4 short, that'll be 3 inches. So I want to cut a 3-inch long slot. There we go. Okay. So let's go ahead and make that. And because this is kind of a tight thing, I don't want to back up out of that. So I'm going to get to the end, I'm going to shut it off and let the bit stop before I pull it back. Because I don't want to stress that bit any at all. This one has a 1/4 inch shank, so it's narrow down at the neck. I don't want to break that bit off. So we'll see here. You'll see what I'm talking about. You're all right as long as you don't move. Just let it coast to a stop. And there it goes. Then I can slide back. Now I'm going to come around, shoot one from the other end. And when that bit first grabs, it wants to kind of pull a little bit, so keep good firm grip on your piece. Push down and against the fence. You don't want that to get away from you. Love this gripper push block. That's a fantastic tool. Hopefully somebody won those. I know we gave some away there. So now I have 2 slots here cut. So I'm going to do my other piece. And again, if you've already determined what your good faces are, then you want to, obviously you're cutting on the inside of this. So let's say you've marked your faces. You don't want to cut on those 2 outer faces. So cut the other 2. One more. Okay, so now I've got 1 slot cut for all 4 legs. Now I want to go, and I'm going to put another slot then on this face, so I have to move my fence over. I don't want to move my stop. Keep the stop right where it is because that needs to stay the same. But now I want to go to where, and you have to use your ruler or eyeball, whatever you think is good, but you want to be an 1/8 inch now from the outer edge to the bit. That looks pretty good. So now we'll just route the others again, and in this case, always take the 1 slot that you've just routed and put that against the fence. Okay, so now I have 2 slots there. I have that's 1 leg. So now on my other, I want to put that against the fence, and I'll route it as well. In interest of time, I won't do the other leg. I'll just kind of go through the process then to show you. So you would do the same for the other blank so that you would have 2 pieces like this. Get them both set up here. Now what you want to do then is to come back and cross-cut your pieces to whatever length you want. So, and I won't do it here because I've got a rip blade in, but so let's say you wanted to do these at 4 1/4. You wanted 1 inch longer than the box width. So let's say you do that. Just simply cross-cut these at 4 1/4 or whatever length you want to do, and just cut those off, and that becomes your leg then. For the purpose of this, I'll go ahead and show you then how to do the sides. So my box sides then will register just like this in the leg blank. So what I need to do is to cut a tail on here. So what I want to get this now is, I don't want to change the bit setup at all. I don't want to change the height of it. Leave the bit exactly the same as it is, same bit, same height. Don't mess with that. But I do need to house it inside the fence a little bit. So I need my screwdriver. So I need to open up the fence a little and just put it back in there because I'm only going to make a partial cut on these. And I want this up real snug on the bit. I don't want it to get in there zero clearance because I don't want to cut into my fence, but I want to be right up next to it. Right up close without cutting into it. So now I know that my stock is 1/2 inch wide and my slot was only 3/8, so I know I'm going to have to take about a 1/16 inch off to get that to go. So what I want to do is I'm going to use my scrap piece here, which is the same thickness, so I'm working from there. I just want to kind of start shaving. I'm going to sneak up on this. I don't want to get it too much. So we're going to just sneak up on the cut a little bit. We're going to cut both sides. So I'm going to use my block and just hold this in here. Hold it up good flat against there, and then you want to keep it flat on the table. So you want as much support as possible you can get here. Get that out of the way. I was kind of catching myself on that. So I'm starting to get there. I'm not quite. So I want to move the fence a little bit away from here. Just move it away from the bit. And again, I just want to sneak up on this. So you're making a pass on each side, so you're removing equal amounts so this tail will be centered. And what I want to do then is to just see how I'm getting, and I've got a little bit of ways to go. I should do a little less sneaking here to get you guys. So now, as you can see, I'm getting closer, and just keep doing a test fit. I'm real close there now. Because once you make those undercut, you can't go back and add on to it. So you don't want them to be too small. You want a good, snug fit. One of the things I'm seeing, I forgot to get a smaller reducer, so what I really need is a reducing ring that'll close up around that bit, because what I'm doing is, with that opening that it's wanting to fall down in there a little bit. So don't do that when you're doing, get the tightest reducing ring you can around the bit. So now just test your fit, and I'm pretty close. There you go. So there's my thing. But you can see I'm 1/4 inch. I got it too snug. Now I can't get it out of there. I want my piece to cover that up. So I'm supposed to be 1/4 inch longer down here. So what I'm going to do is nibble off 1/4 inch off of this dovetail. Okay, so I'm going to want to take 1/4 inch off. So what I want to do is set my blade height for 1/4 inch. So I got my height set that I want to take off. I also want to take off no more than that. So I want to measure how far it is. It's 1/4 inch. That way, the length of my tenon. So I want to take off 1/4 inch. Here, so I want to set my fence so that I'm measuring to this side of the blade over here, including the kerf of the blade plus 1/8 inch. And then what I'm going to do is just nibble off that little bit. I'll take this off. So just by making that little notch, and I'm a little bit off, so I just slide my fence over a little more, make that notch. Then when I slide it down into here, which I know is going to be tight, and then that'll slide down, and it can bottom out in that slot, or you can put it however you want. You can round it off if you want to, but then it will fit snug to the top of your thing, to your leg, and now you've got a nice sliding dovetail fit. So do all 4 legs. Once you get your router bit set, the fence set to the right depth, do all 4 box sides on each of those, and then you just put your box together, and then you've got your nice dovetailed box. Now the one thing is, because of that setup, you have this little kind of an offset here. You've got a corner sticking out inside the box. So, and you've got no way that you can build, because this is a sliding thing, you can't put a slot in the bottom, in for a bottom, and then put it in at pre-assembly or during assembly. So, because in order to slide these down, you can't do then also a horizontal movement. So the only answer for putting a bottom into the box is to do it afterward. So go ahead and assemble your box, glue it together, put your, sand your pieces again by hand, get them all sanded together, and when you're gluing, because you've got cross grain, you don't want to have this grain runs this way, and this one's running that way. So because you're going to have it, you've got a real disaster potential there to break apart on you. So what you want to do then is only glue no more than half the thickness, half the width of your board, of your sideboard. So what I did was put a drop of glue in the slot right here in the center, just a little bit of glue, not much at all. It doesn't take much, because this isn't going anywhere. It's not going to fall apart on you. A little bit of glue will hold this just fine. So that when I put the glue right in the center, and then I put this in and slide it down, so what that does is it glues it from the center to the bottom of the slot. Yeah, nothing at the top. Now you could also then, and what that does is it means that, so the bottom half is going to stay glued. It's not going to move. The top half, if there's any shrinking, will come, or any swelling, will come out the top of the leg, maybe a little bit. You're not going to see much over a 3-inch piece, so you might see a 1/16 of an inch. It's not going to be a lot. But if you didn't want to have that coming out the top of the leg, what you could do is put a little dab of glue just up here on the end of the tenon, not in the slot, but on the tenon, on each side of the tenon, so that it's going in. And then when you put it in here and slide it down, the only part that's going to be glued is going to be this inch or so up here at the top. And that way then it would allow it to expand into the bottom. And because we cut that notch out, we've allowed for that. So you can do it either way. I've done it both ways. I haven't had enough time to find out for sure which way is going to work best. I don't suspect it would be a real issue. The worst thing you can do, though, is to glue the whole tenon, the whole length of that slot. You don't want to glue this thing into wherever it is, because, again, it's captured. You've got 4 pieces going around into this. It's all captured and glued together. It's not going anywhere. So you don't have to, this isn't something you're worrying about sideways forces pulling it apart. This is just going to be, it's got that mechanical advantage of a dovetail joint. And then if you want a little bit, you can play around with this. You can make thicker legs if you want. You can make them so that you've got a little bit more of a shoulder. On this box, I've got about 1/8 of an inch shoulder, so you're out here, it gives you a little more shadow effect. You can do any number of things. I just cut a little chamfer on the bottom side to just kind of lighten the look of it a little bit. I also beveled, just chamfered this little outer corner on this box. I've got another one that I didn't do that. Just similar little things. So play around with it. And to get the bottom in, or after you've glued this together, then I come back and I just glue some cleats on the inside of the side walls, just to put that, just to capture the bottom. So just glue some cleats on there. There's no fasteners or anything, just glue those on. And then I just cut a piece of plywood to fit the bottom, including notching it for these legs. And then just simply set it in and glue it in place. You don't need to worry about expansion or contraction on the box bottom. I've got it in there pretty snug. You got to have it. It's plywood. I mean, it might be a little bit, but it's not gonna blow it apart or anything. You're not gonna have it crack and come apart, because again, any little bit of sideways force is minimal. It's not gonna be a big issue with that, because most of the shrinking and swelling in this is going to be vertically up and down. So the plywood should move with it. And then just make a lid and whatever, just any little fancy stuff. I haven't really talked much about lids, but I just went ahead and made a finished box just so you guys could see the examples of it. Another version of the spline miter is to do a dovetailed spline. which you can do on the router table. Just a dovetail bit. This was an 8-degree dovetail bit, 1/2 inch. And what I used that is, again, making the miter box exactly the same. And this is a jig that you could make one of these pretty easy. This is from MLCS. It's a really nice little jig. Works on the router table. So what this does, it registers in the miter slot on this bar. So let's say you put this in here, get your dovetail bit set, raise it up to the height you want, and then again, just put your box in, which in this case would be, let's say this walnut box, which I've cut in there. You trap it between these two pieces, and then it's just as simple as sliding over the bit, again, making a router cut. Then if you just flip it around, you get perfectly symmetrical slot on the other corner. So just a quick way to do that, nice dovetail bit, just a nice, really nice thing. And then use the same bit. Again, you don't want to change the bit out because that makes your slot, and Chloe, can you zoom in and see this? So I want to take a piece of whatever I'm using for my slot, in this piece of curly maple, and then I'm just going to cut a dovetail thing. Just like I cut the end grain on those pieces there for that leg, this time I'm going to do it on side grain, and I'm just going to cut a dovetailed slot, sneak up on it until I've got a fit that will go into there. It's a little bit loose, but it's shrunk a little bit. But that's the way you do. So then just get that to where you've got the fit that you like, and then just rip this piece loose from your overall blank, and then cut it into short pieces and glue them in. And then it's just the same process, trimming those flush, sanding it, and you're good to go. That you could end up then with a box like that. So that's just another way to do a spline slot. To my knowledge, we don't have a jig for this in Wood Magazine. Maybe we need to. Might be something for the future. But that's a jig that sells through MLCS. I want to say it's about 40 or 50 bucks. You could probably make one if you guys are all pretty sharp. You can probably make something like that. And then I believe that's it. Yeah, so I did have another question for you here, for everybody I brought a box here that I didn't demonstrate, but I was curious to see if any of you would be interested in learning how to make this. It's a double dovetail, so it's an inlaid dovetail. Would that be something that you'd be willing to see if we did this next year? So I'm doing my own little survey.